Welcome to the Authority File. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. My guest for this series is Paul Barrett. Paul is assistant professor at the School of English and Theatre Studies at the University of Guelph in Ontario, Canada. His research sits at the intersection of Canadian literature, critical race studies, and digital humanities. I'll be speaking with Paul about his most recent book, called Remembering Austin Clarke. It's an edited volume of personal reflections, biographical sketches, and scholarly critiques, along with some of Clarke's own selected works, that aims to secure Clarke's position among Canada's most celebrated writers. Clarke was born in Barbados and moved to Toronto in the mid-50s. His novels began appearing in the 60s, and he continued writing well into the 2000s. He won the coveted Giller Prize in 2002 for The Polished Hoe. He was a poet, short story writer, a journalist, and taught at Duke University, the University of Texas, and Yale, establishing Black Studies programs along the way. And yet, despite the awards, prestigious faculty positions, and prolific output, the Canadian literary establishment largely sidelined him because he was Black. In his chapter in the book, Paul describes the situation this way, quote, "Despite his contributions to Canadian writing and his status as a public figure, however, his work is absent from most Canadian literary history and criticism. Indeed, the worst drinking game in Can Lit is to flip to the back of a literary history and take a drink for every Clarke, Austin entry in the index. You will be as sober as a late career Leonard Cohen," unquote. This book, Remembering Austin Clarke, published by Wilfrid Laurier University Press, aims to set the record straight and maybe even get you drunk. In this second episode, we talk about how the book came together, the intense deliberations some of the potential contributors went through before agreeing to the project, and Paul's experience researching in the Austin Clarke archives. So going back to the book itself, I'm wondering if you could talk us through a little bit of the origins of the book. The connection to the Puritan literary magazine. So I'm wondering if you could kind of contextualize that for us. What's the relation there? And then, kind of how your book kind of sprang out of that.
Sure. So the book really emerged from some of the research I was doing as a postdoctoral fellow at McMaster University. And I was working in the Clarke archives, and I was thinking, his archives are so extensive. There's so much material here that merits attention. And I think I published an article out of that work and put together a few other things. But I thought there's so much here, so much that needs to be considered. And a friend of mine was on the masthead at the Puritan Literary Magazine, which is a great journal in and around Ontario and Toronto, publishing emerging writers and young writers. They do great stuff. And he just said, well, why don't we do a special issue on Austin Clarke? And, then you're not bound by the academic press route, which, okay, it's going to take 7 years to get this book, and everybody knows what that looks like. He said, why don't we just put this thing together? And I mean, really, that came together on a Toronto patio in a summer evening where I met with the masthead of the journal, and everyone there, Ted Nolan, Andre Forget, and Tyler Willis all said, yeah, this is fantastic. We'd love to do it. And at the time, Clarke was alive. So we wrote to him, and in the hopes that we could both get his approval as well as get him involved, interview him, and so forth. And that's when I really spoke to Ronaldo Walcott, and Ronaldo said he's not well enough to participate in anything like this. But Ronaldo agreed to meet, and we had some discussions, and he put me in touch with a number of the contributors. So that's really where it emerged from. And Andre Forget, who was the editor of the Puritan at the time, and myself really developed it as a special issue for the magazine, and then transformed it into the book. Andre really is a co-editor on this book.
And then despite his condition, did Austin ever was he involved in any way, or did he get to see it, or?
No, he passed away before the special issue came out.
Mm-hmm.
Not long before, but before, I think about maybe a month, maybe about 3 weeks.
Right.
But no, he was not well enough to participate in any sort of way. So I'd met him a couple times while doing my postdoctoral work. I went over to meet him, but this was prior to prior to this special issue.
Okay. I'm glad you mentioned the archives. So I was hoping you could describe your work in the Clarke archives a little bit more, and talk a little bit about what that was like. Um, had you done research in this way before? How did this process inform what ended up in the collection? And then, really in what ways, what did it reveal to you about Clarke himself?
Yeah, so my first time ever going to the McMaster archives was when I was working on my PhD. And there was this little project, it was a book history project
Mm,
where I think you could get a little bit of funding to go to an archival site and write up a history of the publication of a book in Canadian literature. And McMaster has a lot of that stuff. So I thought, okay, well, I'll go to McMaster and look at the Austin Clarke archives and see what they have. And he just published his final novel around this time, More. And I thought, okay, this could be an interesting publication history. So I went and looked through the material, and it turned out he'd been working on the book for 35 years. And this is where I started working on Clarke more seriously, as well as More. So he writes a letter to his friend and fellow writer Sam Selvin, and he says, the line is, I'm dreaming of the millions this book is going to bring out, and I'm already tasting the Johnny Walker Double Black that I'm going to be drinking with that millions. This is in 1972. Like this novel was not coming out for a long time after, which gives you a clue about the kind of, okay, maybe the novel was not in the best shape then, but it gives you a sense of just the critical neglect that his work suffered, as
mm,
well as Sam Selvin. Sam Selvin's a fantastic writer who ended up working as a janitor at the University of Calgary when he couldn't be reviewed, he wasn't read when he was in Canada, and so on. So I wrote my piece on More, and in the process, that's when I met Austin. I emailed him and said, hey, I'm writing this piece on More. I just have a few questions from some gaps in the archives. I understand the publication history up to this point, but can't remember what comes next. And he just wrote and said, come by the house, and gave me his address. Be cool, Austin, which of course was great, but also terrifying.
right.
When you're a grad
Yeah.
student, you're not really equipped to go to the writer or write. You know how to deconstruct a text, but you don't really know how to go to a person's house and say, hey, so tell me about the publication history.
Right.
And I also at that time didn't really have a sense of, the material life of being an author, of what that entails.
Mm,
So meeting Austin and working in his archives gave me a sense of that. The archives were a source of income for Austin, right? When we talk about style, part of the style is improvisation, making something out of scarce resources. And for Austin, as a Black writer working in Canada from 1960 onwards, improvisation was key, right? So the
hmm
archives are part of that. Being able to improvise, to sell things to McMaster, to negotiate prices, to receive tax credits in years when books were going to be coming out in order to maximize returns. There are letters in Clarke's archives complaining about how cheap the archives are. So he would write those letters to friends and then sell them back to the archives. You know, it's good improvisation. But when you think about his archives are extensive, a person could do more than one lifetime worth of work there.
Yeah.
But when you think about style, those archives are also cultivated. So he's careful to exclude certain things. He's careful to ensure that as the person reading his work, that he sent his daughters to one of the best private schools in Toronto, that, there are BMW receipts in the
Mm,
archives. Why?
yeah.
So I know that he drove a BMW despite, hard times.
Yeah. So it's like he curated his own archive basically along the
Absolutely.
way. Yeah.
And that's sort of evident in Ronaldo Walcott's piece in the book where he talks about the trouble of intimacy
hmm
because you can come to know somebody whether it's through their writing or through their archives or anything like that, but intimacy is, as he says, always doubled, right?
Yeah.
That intimacy has been curated in some ways by both parties.
hmm True. Um, there are some example of Austin Clarke's work in the volume. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you selected those works, and do they relate, and how do they relate to some of the contributions?
Yeah, the material in the volume, there's a lot of material in his archives that has remained unpublished. TV plays, radio documentaries, poems, etc. But this is representative, I think, of who he was as a writer. And these are some of the better material in the archives. So there's a poem in there for the children of Lamona Johnson. So Lamona Johnson is the widow of Albert Johnson. Albert Johnson was a man who was killed by the Toronto police in 1978, a black man who was shot in his home and shot under racist circumstances. The police were acting on a tip, allegedly, and kill him in his own home on a Sunday morning. And he becomes a touchstone for a lot of black writers in Canada and really kicks off the the civil rights work that Austin Clarke was involved in at the time. And Clarke writes about him a great deal. So there's a poem in there for the children of Albert Johnson and Albert Johnson's wife. There's also a short story that's kind of fantastical called The Robber. In some ways, a kind of response to Invisible Man, but very fantastical and strange, about this guy named Loftus, who decides suddenly that no white person in Toronto can see him. And he's standing on the corner. He realizes, oh, no one can see me. I'm just completely invisible, and decides to just walk into a bank and take the money. And then it becomes very ridiculous, actually. But I like that story because it's not just an excoriation of racism. It's playful. It's imaginative. It's absurd. So it's so many of the things that make Clarke's writing really interesting, but also compelling and powerful.
Does that kind of style appear in elsewhere in his work, or is it sort of unique in that respect? Especially the fantastical element of it.
Yeah, I'm thinking about that. I would say that's pretty unique.
Yeah.
There are moments in his text where you don't know where you are. So he has his second novel, Amongst Thistles and Thorns. The main character, Milton, at some point I believe he's hiding under the church floorboards, and suddenly imagines himself in Harlem. And he's in the Harlem of the 1960s, and he's, participating in that community and confronting the police and so on. And then all of a sudden he's back in Barbados. And you think, well, is this a fantasy or is this real? Or so it's not, I don't know if it's quite fantastical, but it's certainly not realist in a traditional sense that we. Yeah.
I get the sense that those sort of dreamlike sequences they show up fairly often.
All the time. And I think, to my mind, that has to do with Clarke's interest in the new possibility for people to move physically, to go elsewhere, to reinvent themselves, but then finding out that the promise of movement is rarely fulfilled. Yeah. Right. So one can arrive in Canada physically, but one never really arrives in Canada as a citizen.
So this is a good segue in my next question. And in the chapter that you wrote, Paul, you note that sort of the fragmented nature of the collection in your book sort of mirrors Clarke's own fragmentary style, as you describe it. Can you talk about that a little bit more? What are the similarities in between the volume and his work, and was this intentional, or did it just kind of end up that way?
No, it is intentional. And I think that was one of our goals. I think Clarke's work in some ways resists a traditional monograph, a traditional single author reading of all of his work, in the sense that there are so many dimensions that it requires multiple approaches. And in the sense that he's so contradictory. His style is so complex and contradictory. And he as a person, he's not just a writer, he's a public figure. He worked for the Caribbean Broadcast Corporation. He set up Black Studies programs across the United States. How do you capture all of that in a traditional academic monograph? So the idea of the images on the cover of the book and the approach to the text is to give you different views on who Austin Clarke was as a writer, as a thinker, revel in all of his contradictions.
Yeah. Okay. Excellent. You just heard from Paul Barrett. Paul is assistant professor at the School of English and Theatre Studies at the University of Guelph in Ontario, Canada. Paul's most recent book is called Remembering Austin Clarke. It's a volume of contributed essays about the Canadian writer. The book, published by Wilfrid Laurier University Press, also features selected works by Clarke. Wilfrid Laurier University Press is the sponsor of this series. Join us next week when we continue our conversation and talk about why it was necessary for this volume to establish a place of greater respect for Austen Clarke in the Canadian literary establishment. We'll also go over some of the more difficult to reconcile characteristics of Clarke's writing, and we'll get to hear a recording from one of his readings.
Well, multiculturalism gone out the window now. All the pamphlets and the television commercials that show people of all colors laughing together and saying, "We is Canadians." All them advertisements in Saturday Night and Maclean's, all them speeches that ministers up in Ottawa make concerning the different cultures that make up this great unified country of ours. All that lick up now and gone through the editors. One time, bram!
If you like what you hear, rate us or give us a review on your podcast platform of choice, and if there's a topic you'd like us to cover, drop me a line. I'm at bmickey@ala-choice.org. As always, sponsorship and advertising for the Authority File podcast are handled by Choice's advertising manager, Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced by Choice's senior digital media producer, Mark Dirks, and digital media assistant, Sabrina Kofer. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.